And we're back. Moving into the emotion section of the chapter, there's our definition of emotion: a mental state that arises spontaneously, all of a sudden, very often, rather than through conscious effort. So when we try to make ourselves happy, there are ways to do it, but it's not necessarily a conscious thing that we do. We just kind of suddenly realize, oh, I'm happy. That's often accompanied by physiological change. That's an important part of the definition there, very important part, because while you can think whatever you want to think without anybody knowing what you're thinking, it's very difficult to have a strong feeling without betraying that feeling to other people. We read facial expressions just naturally, instinctively, so most can tell when they're talking to somebody who's angry, who's sad, who's scared. So that's the physiological change, that emotion is felt, is perceived in the brain, and is felt in the body. Let's go to the basics. They're universal expressions of emotion. Here is the physiological presentation of the behavior of the mind of emotion. No matter where you go in the world, who you talk to, when you show these facial cards to individuals and ask them what emotion that person is experiencing, they are universally recognized. This person is happy. This person is surprised. This person is afraid. This person is sad. This person is disgusted. And no, this person is angry, and this person is disgusted. Kind of close. But you see the more wrinkling of the nose here with the disgust and then the anger. These were identified by a scientist named Dr. Ekman back in 1972, and as psychologists do, had to add in two more: anticipation and acceptance. Felt like those were both recognizable on the face and in the behavior of the individual, and were not adequately subsumed under any of these basic 6 emotions. So basic 8 emotions are important to recognize. I'm not asking you to memorize them. But what about rage? What about annoyance? Joy and depression? Are there different words that we use which seem to take us to a different number of basic emotions? Well, quite a while ago, a man named Plutchik said that we have different words for the expression of the same emotion. And so we have high intensity emotion words like rage and ecstasy and amazement, and we have low intensity words like boredom and annoyance and serenity. But each of those words fit within one of the 8 basic emotions. And he designed this colorful chart. The more intense the color, the more intense the basic emotion. The lower intensity of color, the lower intensity of the same emotion. So high intensity joy is ecstasy, low intensity joy is peace and serenity. High intensity sadness is grief, low intensity sadness is pensiveness. And so it folds off down into this nice top here. He even included the emotions we experience when we have a combination of basic emotions. So joy plus acceptance is love. Fear plus surprise is awe, and so on and so forth. You can read around there. Okay, and we go back. So we got the basics out of the way. Let's talk about how emotion arises. Where does it come from? 2 theories that go together. The first is the James Lange theory. Back in 1885, James and Lange, 2 different researchers, kind of came up with the same idea at the same time, published it at the same time. And the basic theory is that when I see this guy walking down the alley towards me, and he's 9 feet tall, and he's drooling saliva mixed with blood, because my brain interprets danger subconsciously, my muscles tense up and I go into fight or flight, getting ready to run or stand and fight. And James Lang said that when my body recognizes muscle tension or the physiological change, an event occurs, big scary alien, I experience the physical changes, and then I consciously recognize those changes, and I say, my body's all tense and sweaty, I must be terrified. So the logical conclusion to the James Lang theory is that we tense up in response to fearful stimuli, and that's how we realize we're afraid. We experience the tension. Or we cry in response to sad stimuli, and we consciously realize we're sad as the tears are rolling down our face. And this, you probably experienced that in a movie theater where you're minding your own business and all of a sudden something horrible happens to a character that you identify with on the screen. They start crying and you start crying as well. We cry in response to sad stimuli, and you're sitting there in the theater going, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm crying. I don't want to cry in front of other people. Sometimes we can't hold those tears back. And that's when we realize, wow, what's happening is really sad. Another conclusion from the James Lang theory happened in 1988. Theorist Martin Stepper identified that when a person is smiling, they're going to perceive that they are happier. That's called the facial feedback hypothesis. So, something happens, it makes me smile, somebody tells a joke and I laugh, and my brain recognizes the muscle tension in my face that it knows to be happiness, and it says, I must be happy. Have you ever heard somebody say when you're having a bad day, smile? That is legitimate, and research demonstrates that people who do smile in negative situations actually feel slightly better, sometimes a lot better. The next theory is the Cannon-Bard theory back in 1927. Cannon-Bard added something to James Lang. So they said, yes, when you're walking down the alley and you see this guy coming towards you, your muscles tense up because your body goes into fight or flight, but you also think a scary thought, he's going to eat me. So they added in thought to the whole process and said that because the physiological changes that we experience based in response to emotion are limited. Body and face can only do so many things. Your body can only experience emotion in so many ways that a thought has to be in there as well to interpret the event itself. So we think scary thoughts and tense up in response to a fearful stimuli, and we know we're afraid. We think sad and cry in response to sad stimuli, and we know that we're sad. And how many of you cry when you're angry? Well, you're not sad, you're angry. The tears are from the anger. How many of you have ever cried for joy? Well, you're not sad when you're crying for joy. You're joyful, and you recognize that you're really joyful because you're crying in the situation. So there's the necessity of adding in thought to interpret the actual event. I got a sweet card from my daughter when she was very young, and she had recorded her own message in the card. It was one of those that you open it up and it plays the recorded message. And I had seen her working on it earlier, and she had hidden herself away from everybody else. So it was my birthday. When I opened the card, I burst out into really ugly tears. I'm a guy who I don't enjoy crying. I don't cry very often. There's nothing wrong with crying. It's just programming from early on. Men do cry, but yeah, anyway. And I couldn't stop. It was one of those situations where I could not bring myself under control. And there's my daughter, my sister, and my wife were sitting in the room with me. And I wasn't sad, but they were tears of joy. And so, fortunately, my wife said something wise. I heard her say, "Oh, Daddy's so happy he's crying," because it kind of scared my daughter. Anyway, that was an example of I needed the thought in there to interpret the tears, or else they would have been misidentified as sadness. You can review this slide, but what it does is it gives you a visual representation of James Lang. A gentleman sees something that is going to create emotion. It goes to the thalamus. Remember the switchboard of the brain. The thalamus routes that information to the limbic system, the unconscious emotion evoker in the brain. Body reacts in response to the limbic system, and his cortex, the smart part of the brain, reads that bodily reaction. And here's the addition of thought. So the stimulus comes in, goes to the thalamus routes it to the limbic system, but at the same time routes it to the cortex. So now I experience my bodily reaction, and I experience my cortex awareness of the meaning of the stimuli. We're going to move to this cognitive theory here. Cognitive theory says there are two factors that are important in the perception of emotion. It doesn't wipe out James Lange or Cannon-Bard. It expands upon it. So the two things that happen, the two factors involved in emotion, are the perception of physiological change. I'm crying, I'm tense, I'm shaky, I'm sweaty, whatever that is, I blush. So I interpret, or I perceive that change, and then I find an explanation or a label for that change. So it says sort of that the thought is slightly delayed, that I experience the physiological symptoms of the emotion, and then I try to figure out why are tears rolling down my chin, or why am I so shaky? And so this adds in our understanding that, how many of you have, when you're afraid, you actually feel angry about it? So this simple little chart or diagram, we've got the guy who's feeling warm, he's sweating, his heart's accelerated, you can feel his heart through his chest, and his hands are a little bit shaky. That's the first factor. He's perceiving physiological change. And now here over second factor, he's looking for an explanation. So if you experience those symptoms, and you look up and you're looking at a large grizzly bear coming towards you, you understand that this is because you're afraid. If, on the other hand, there's an incredibly attractive person in front of you, you interpret all of these symptoms as feeling love or lust. If you're experiencing these symptoms and your professor has just put an exam in front of you, you interpret these symptoms as anxiety. And if you're in a gym and you just finished working out and you experience these symptoms, you know that it's not an emotion. You're physically exhausted from the workout. This leads to a very interesting idea called misattribution of arousal. An attribution is placing blame when I experience something, I try to attribute it to a cause. Who caused that to happen? Think of a pandemic. Who do we blame? There are some people who want to blame one group of people. There are other people who want to blame another group of people. No matter who you blame, you're attributing the danger and the damage to another source. So if I misattribute arousal, I get it wrong. I attribute the arousal to the wrong source. And this can lead to mistaking one emotion for another, or over-exaggerating certain emotions. The famous experiment that I will link to, it's another YouTube video. It's the bridge experiment. I encourage you to watch that. It's very brief. And these are the results of that bridge experiment. On the bridge, a woman approached. I'm going to let you read it because I don't want to bore you with my own. But these are the results. After you watch it, these results will make sense. But these are the percent of men who were relaxed on the bridge, how many of them called the interviewer later on that evening, and this is the percentage of the men on the shaky bridge who were likely experiencing fear during the interview. This is the percentage of those men, almost 65%, well, I guess a little bit above 65% of those men called the interviewer later on in the evening, and you can watch the video to find out why. So it's appropriate as we're talking about the physiological component of emotion. All emotion has a physiological component. We can tap into, though, if we can read those physiological changes, then we might be able to take a stab at what that person is experiencing, even if they're trying to hide it. So some of you may have taken a lie detector test. They're much less commonly given unless something's really gone wrong, or unless you're going to become a police officer, firefighter, in the CIA, FBI, or if you're accused of committing a crime, you might be strapped into a lie detector test. I'm going to also post a video of that as well, so you can watch that. But the basics of that is the lie detector measures 3 physiological realities of your body at any one time: your heart rate, your respiration, puts a band across your chest and measures how many times you breathe per minute, and then your GSR, your galvanic skin response. This is very, very slight, imperceptible to us changes in the conductivity of our skin for electricity. So amount of sweat you're putting out, basically. The polygraph, the polygrapher asks you questions, and you respond to those questions, and they measure your heart rate, respiration, and GSR in response to each of those answers that you gave. So they'll ask you control questions, where you don't have to, where it's easy not to lie, and where you do tell the truth. And then they ask you the relevant question, where they think maybe you are lying, and they measure the difference between your arousal when you tell the truth and your arousal when you lie, or your arousal when you answer this question. If it changes significantly, then something's happened. You've responded to that question physiologically, and polygraphers say that demonstrates that you're lying. Why does our heart rate, respiration, and GSR increase when we lie? Because lying comes with a threat, the threat of being found out. And my brain has no choice but to respond to threat with a slight boost in my fight or flight mechanism. When I put myself in danger by lying, I'm creating a threat to myself, and my body gets me ready for that threat by pushing me into fight or flight. However, the same heart rate, respiration, and GSR increase when I'm nervous. And maybe I'm nervous answering the questions even though I'm telling the truth. Maybe I'm angry and offended by the question. If my daughter went missing and I was taken to the police department and given a lie detector, I can imagine that if the police officer is asking me, the polygrapher is asking me, did you do something bad to your daughter? Well, that would evoke an emotion within me. Heck no, I didn't. That's righteous indignation. And that anger might be read as increased heart rate, respiration, and GSR, and that would result in a false positive, that although my body reacted to the question, it reacted out of anger, not the fear, which would correspond to a lie. So you've got to be careful when we think about taking those polygraph tests, and I'll let you watch the video and see some different judgments about those tests. I'm pushing it on time, but I have... I'm going to skip that. Although we know that my limbic system, my amygdala, is what primarily responds to fear and anger. And what this is demonstrating is that in a relatively recent experiment, Joseph Ledoux wrote some really good books on emotion that are in layperson language. If you want to look those up, look for Joseph Ledoux. I think he wrote 2. Anyway, he was able to trace the path of electrical stimuli in a rat brain, and they conditioned a rat to fear a sound, and he was able to trace the path from the ear deeper into the brain in that rat when they played the sound. And so he found that the path split, just like the cognitive theorists put forward, that you hear the sound, it's routed to the thalamus routes it to the cortex, and then the cortex says, ooh, that sound means I'm going to be shocked or I'm going to be hurt, and it goes to the amygdala to get you ready. But they also found that the thalamus splits that so that my amygdala gets the information slightly before my cortex does, maybe a fraction of a second. And so if you've ever had the hackles raise on the back of your neck, That's your amygdala getting a signal, in some cases, that something's not right. And your skin has tightened, and it raises the hairs on the back of your neck. Skin tightening is part of your body's protective mechanism. So maybe somebody has said something, or maybe you smell smoke and you don't know it yet because your cortex hasn't quite got that message as quickly. Okay, I'm going to pause here and pick up with just a couple more points.